Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse. In this episode, we talk about the recent statement from Malcolm Gladwell, who said that he was cowed in 2022 into taking a position on trans athletes that he didn't actually hold himself. It's a massive thing to think that somebody of Malcolm Gladwell's caliber could be cowed by culture, but it's also a helpful sign that somebody in 2025 could say, hey, I was wrong. I'll do better in the future. We take that apart, think about what it means for us culturally that we're in that moment, and then we think about and conclude by thinking about how this transformation applies to us as we live our Christian lives. As always, feel free to share this with other people, like or subscribe, and if you want to support the work that we do, you can do so by visiting www.toltogether.com.
So we're sort of returning to a subject here a little bit. We've talked about Malcolm Gladwell in the past, but he's sort of in the news. I don't think that this has received that much attention, but he admitted on a podcast that he doesn't agree with what he actually said at an open forum during a Q&A session about trans athletes competing.
This was in 2022.
In 2022 in women's divisions. The reason that's a pertinent date is because we talked about Malcolm Gladwell debating Douglas Murray on the trustworthiness of legacy media. And that was around...
Oh, man. That's a little on the nose.
Yeah. What a tangled web we weave. So that was around 2022 when that debate happened. It was also around the time of these remarks. Douglas Murray, never one to take any prisoners whatsoever, wasted no time in writing about this and saying, hey, this was my experience debating Malcolm Gladwell around this same time. I found that he, of all of my many opponents, was consistently one to view everything that I said in bad faith. And so he excoriates him throughout this article, calls him a coward. Malcolm Gladwell's own words on the subject were, I felt cowed to give an answer I didn't agree with personally. But so
is there an etymological link between cowed and coward?
Yes, I'm pretty certain that there is.
Let's see. Is that what that means? Okay, I have a slightly different first feeling. I appreciate him being honest. That's a big thing to do. To come out and say I was wrong. Anyway, we'll get to that. But while maybe I can sympathize with Murray's difficulty in debating somebody like that at the time, and I'm not giving Gladwell a pass, I still am. Anyway, that's not my main takeaway from this interaction, but I'm glad he did it and had the confidence to do so.
Likewise, I think it's a symptom of our age that we feel we have to pounce in these instances, going along with what you said, Murray comes to the end of the article and basically says that people like Malcolm Gladwell are not only cowards, but that they deserve our contempt.
Okay, well,
and I thought, here I'm going to part ways.
Okay, but let's go back just in case people aren't familiar with the story here. So Malcolm Gladwell is moderating a conversation that's on a well-known sports podcast. It's hosted at a conference at MIT in 2022 on the inclusion of women in trans sports. So specifically, I'm thinking here around the idea of biological men competing in female categories.
Biological males competing.
Yeah. And what Gladwell says is that the guy who is representing the side of saying, hey, this is an unfair advantage. I think Gladwell himself said, I think about 90% of the people in the room agreed with you, but said nothing. But when your opponent spoke, there was wild applause.
Yeah.
And he felt that cowed is the word, into not saying more there to point or kind of highlight that distinction. Two things stand out to me here, Cameron. One is, if Malcolm Gladwell can feel cowed into not speaking what he thinks, that is lunacy. That is cultural craziness right there. Say something just a second about the heft that Malcolm Gladwell has in the intellectual publishing journalism sphere.
Oh, sure.
Like, this is like saying Arnold Schwarzenegger saying I was afraid to arm wrestle somebody. Like, it's a wild thing for me to try
Yeah.
to inhabit that in my mind.
Malcolm Gladwell is a publishing juggernaut, huge bestseller, major figure. Even though there are some of us who are sort of snobbily rolling our eyes, not saying that I would do that, but I mean, and you can find whole sections of Malcolm Gladwell in airports, for goodness sakes. He just kind of became one of those key public intellectuals. He's publishing books that are bestsellers. He's writing routinely for the New Yorker. He has highly successful podcasts, revisionist history.
His speaking fee
Broken
is
Record.
$200,000 if you'd like him to come to your event to speak.
Wow. That's news to me. I just have to
Two
pause
to
for a second.
300,000.
Just let that.
Yeah, that dwarfs our entire budget for our entire thinking out loud team for a year. But anyway,
I'm reconfiguring some of our fees. I'm just kidding. You've seen the Clintons speaking fees, right?
Yeah, okay. Well, let's not go that direction. But I'm just saying,
Okay.
Malcolm Gladwell, if there's anybody who seemingly would have the ability to say whatever he wants and be willing to suffer the consequences, it'd be fine. It would be him, you would think.
No, see, the operative word being seeming. Everything we've just named is the reason that he felt he can't. Yeah. So that's that.
If you were making a couple $1,000,000 a year speaking and you knew that you took on a position that was going to get you disinvited from those exact speaking events,
Correct.
there you have it.
And also, yeah, that also paints a sad picture of our cultural moment where we prioritize fads, fashions, and entertainment over the truth. But that's not news. That's been happening for a long time, and very much a symptom of our age. But we've kind of it's reached a level that I do think is probably without precedent. But it's true. We so also emphasize a vision of success that has a lot to do with platform, fame, power, and influence. And somebody like Malcolm Gladwell has all of that in droves. But it's never been more fragile. And
Yeah, it's like wealth without security.
And so there are plenty of us who can run our mouths right now with relative impunity. There's the stray possibility that something that you say might get picked up and go viral for all the wrong reasons, and then you get in a lot of trouble. But most of us can do that. But if you have millions and millions of followers, every word that you say is carefully weighed in the balances. And one misstep, and your career could indeed be over. Does this take Malcolm Gladwell off the hook? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just explaining some of the social phenomena that contribute to somebody who is styled as an intellectual and a spokesman for the truth and a journalist of integrity, but then pointing to the reality behind the scenes of why they might not fulfill those roles or live up to those ideals, I should say.
Okay. So, I mean, we could spend the rest of the conversation on just that question, and that would be fine. But let me ask let's take us in a slightly different direction here. Because he says that here in 2025, if that same format conference podcast happened again, that the sentiment would have been very different and there would have been a totally different outcome to the conversation. What happened, Cameron?
What happened? I think a combination of, it's hard to say precisely. I don't think I know entirely. I think general sense of weariness, a growing voice that regular people have. And by regular people, I just mean people who don't write for the New Yorker on a routine basis or write for the New York Times or something like that. But regular people now increasingly have ways of getting their words out there. They have in other words, I think a word I hesitate to use because it's often misconstrued and it can be a bit nebulous. But I think growing populism, where just the citizens of the flyover nation are just voicing their very straightforward concerns that in this case, biological males have a massively unfair advantage against female athletes. And that this is just for many people, let me put it this way, Nathan. There are certain issues that are so obvious that only an intellectual or an academic could complicate them. I think and this is one of those issues. I think most people, this is just straightforwardly, yeah, biological males should not compete against female athletes, period. Hello?
But yeah, well, here's like, this is not, let me be very clear here. This is not a religious movement. This is part of the difficulty with that was the internal conflicts with feminism in and of itself. And I think a more left leaning political philosophy and theory that said we have to protect women felt an internal contradiction here with, wait a second, we're not doing, there was the gears did not match up inside a movement with itself on this topic. And that was a major part of this also, of like, wait a second, both of these things can't be true at the same time. So I think there's a lot of that going on.
Second factor. The first factor would be can we just call it populism, and not meaning that in any kind of derogatory sense, just meaning regular people having more of a voice and their concerns just getting a little bit more airtime. But then you named some of the internal incoherences or the internal squabbles, tensions within the LGBTQIA plus movement. When you actually press into those details, it's a movement often that, if it is united at all, it's united politically really only because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But beyond that, there are huge internal inconsistencies and tensions and indeed contradictions. And feminism is where a lot of that comes to a head as well, because the trans movement poses a clear threat to a lot of the goals and aspirations of the feminist movement in the first place. And so that has become more and more apparent. You're right. I think that's that kind of unraveling that's happened. I think we will expect to see more and more of that. I think the whole allies thing has come to an end.
There's a weird sense here in which maybe your more conservative populist movement was working with your more radical feminist side to say the same thing. And so it was
and that's happened in the past before, Nathan.
It was a movement where,
with regard to,
well, I was going to say, remember when Bruce Jenner was like the Woman of the Year for Vogue magazine, and then you kind of had the more populist vision of like, look at that, men are better at women than everything, including being women. Yep. There was that kind of language out there, but then I think there also was a certain degree of legitimate concern for the feminist mind. It's like, this person, Bruce, does not have the experience of what it means to be a woman and to live as a woman in the 21st century. And there was a radical.
Yep.
Yeah. So it had it had internal problems, and then it had external pressure from all sides.
And I think there is also, you might add to that a growing scientific consensus against sexual reassignment surgery that, for whatever reason, has not really taken root in North America yet, or, not in the United States, not in Canada, but it has in Europe. And what's interesting about that is that, Europe is highly progressive and usually at the very forefront of, the vanguard of these issues. And yet this this particular practice, this medical practice is widely being outlawed and resisted there because of its deleterious effects. And so I think that's coming here too. This is a fiercely contentious and political issue, as all issues are nowadays in the United States. But I think we're going to see, I think that's also a factor right
What
now.
what we don't do well with as Americans is trying something new and then accepting that it didn't work. That's almost
Yes.
inconceivable to us
The
that the
sunk
new thing
cost thing. Yeah.
isn't, and so we
Yeah.
have a very hard time letting go of, um I mean, there have been other iterations of this. What was it like when Facebook started, like the metaverse thing, and that was going to be, you could live like that didn't really go anywhere. Um, but there are some of these,
Yeah.
or yet we could say, but there are some of these things that aren't actually new. They just pop up perennially through history. We give them a
Yeah.
try for a little bit, and then we're like, "No, this isn't really going to work, and this isn't healthy." Um, and was it Louise Perry? What's her name? UK author, speaker, um, writes. Kind of, she had a line that she got from somebody who, I think I've quoted her before, and this was in reference to winemaking. But she said, "Great traditions are experiments that worked."
Mhm.
And so very often the quote way things have been done aren't done that way because there were no other options and somebody just forced that one to be the way that it worked. It's like that's the one that actually just worked. And so I don't think
Mhm.
there's been a deep history of like, oh, the reason we had male and female sports is because of patriarchy. I think it's like people probably thought about this.
Yeah.
Now, or were there massive like misunderstandings of what women were physiologically capable of? Absolutely. Think how long it was before women were able to run in the Boston Marathon, for example. I mean, so there's
Right.
ignorance around some of this for sure, but it wasn't a, um, but it wasn't like, and then that year when a lady ran the Boston Marathon, then suddenly they put men in a women's category in all the running events in the Olympics. Like that's not how that worked out. And so it's one of these things that I think is helpful, particularly if you're a Christian and you're part of a church or church leadership, to think through is there are some issues that you will think about for a couple decades as a church and then say, no, actually, I think we'll stick with the way we were doing things. I saw this
Mhm.
play out, Cameron, and I don't know where this will all go. Um, but certainly in some of the denominational conversations I was a part of, where there was a clear generational distinction between being, let's say, more progressive and more conservative on gender ideologies and definitions of marriage and that sort of thing. And the younger generations were more conservative on this. The older folks were more
Mhm.
open to, let's give it a try. Let's see what happens. Let's talk about it for 40 years. And then you had, I think, a crowd that came along and was like, okay, you know what? We've talked about this for 40 years. I don't think we're going to stir up anything new on this. We're going to stick with, like, I'm pretty sure this is how things work theologically,
Mhm.
physiologically, biologically. Let's do that. And with an extreme, and I think a renewed sense of awareness and compassion and carefulness in the way in which we articulate these things and make sure we're not excluding anybody or anything. Um, and so maybe the tone and the style of engagement is different, but the core concepts are reverting back to kind of what's worked for humanity for the history of humanity. And so know that as a church leader or somebody who's involved in Christian circles is there will be ideas that pop up, and just because it's a new idea does not mean it's the idea that will always be there for the future or necessarily that it's a good one just
Mhm.
because it's new, because oftentimes it's not new, it's just a reiteration of something we've already seen in the past.
Yeah. I'm wondering though, let's go back to what you said now about the fact that you're grateful that Malcolm Gladwell made this admission. I am as well. And I think that we have to I think it's right to say that there's a certain amount of courage in making an admission like this. And I think, somebody as self-aware as Malcolm Gladwell would be, he'd expect some major backlash for saying something like that. And yet he did. A long time ago, for us, several years ago, we actually devoted an entire podcast to the importance of being able to get things wrong,
Hmm.
and that this is an important part of our intellectual and moral development. Now, I know that what we're talking about, we were talking about when we make mistakes, especially, for
Right.
instance, on this
Yeah.
podcast. We talk about current events. We're going to get things wrong. That's the nature of the beast. We're talking here with with Malcolm Gladwell, we're talking about intellectual dishonesty, which is a little bit more serious. But the fact that he did, in other words, he didn't have to say this, but he did. And I also am grateful that he did that. And maybe my hope would be that he is setting a kind of example. Do I think that a lot of people are going to follow in his footsteps? Absolutely not. But I do think it's a big deal when somebody of Gladwell's stature makes an admission like this publicly. So
It's a good sign.
I think that's worth, yeah, I do think it's a good sign. And I don't think that's naive to say that. I don't think that's hopeless optimism. I think I think it's genuinely encouraging. And I can also say that as a person, just full disclosure, I've never been a Malcolm Gladwell fan. I've had, over the years, many people try to foist his books on me. And my spidey sense has always just resisted. I listened maybe to, he did a podcast several years ago on black metal, which is something that I used to be really into when I was younger, and it was called True Norwegian Black Metal on his, I think it was his Broken Record podcast. And so I listened to that because it was quite amusing, and it was quite ironical. It was pretty well done. But that's about the extent of my experience with Malcolm Gladwell.
Mhm.
But I did appreciate him saying that.
I want to live in a world where people can say I was wrong.
And so I think we need to say a few things about, ironically, in response, and maybe perhaps distancing ourselves a little bit from Douglas Murray's conclusion to that article. Because here's what I think is kind of ironic. Murray has himself a very powerful platform and has built an amazing career out of being a kind of uncompromising, take no prisoners political commentator and journalist. And while I might find myself in sympathy with some of what he says, I'm usually at odds with his tone, and I am completely opposed to his call for
Mocking criticism.
Criticism, contempt, you viewing people, expressing your contempt for people like Malcolm Gladwell. Because, and here's why, I think you and I both should talk about this a little bit. I have some very concrete reasons. I think by doing that, you are feeding the very cultural nihilism that you're supposedly decrying.
Okay. Yeah. Let me say a couple things on this. Yeah. So, and this is where I see a distinction between church life and the rest of life, in that my experience growing up in the church, living different states, different parts of the world, being part of churches, is that when somebody says, I was wrong and I'm sorry for this, I was involved in this, I didn't know better, I was ignorant of this, I repent of that, I am seeking the forgiveness of the individual or the group or whatever here, and thank God I can change. And God has done a new thing in me, and I've devoted my life to moving in a different direction. You know how that's received? With hugs and tears. And they're welcomed into a new thing, and it's like, great, let's journey together. Now you're with us. That's been my overwhelming experience on people changing their mind. Step outside of the church, and changing your mind is a sign of weakness, and you're forever, kicked to the curb and relegated. And so that when you live in a culture in which forgiveness is not a possibility, you jettison the possibility of truth. Because if people are afraid to say what they think is true because they know that they can't be forgiven for having a different opinion in the past, very rarely is somebody going to say, actually, I was wrong. And so that's the strength of the moment of this. When Gladwell, and maybe, he's got his millions, he'll be fine if he gets canceled from his speaking events. But wouldn't it be great if we were moving into a time in which culturally we could also admit, like, hey, I said these things 5 years ago, and the facts have changed. I've understood new things in a new way. I don't believe that anymore. And now I could be elected, and my past wouldn't forever be a blot against us, because we actually think people do change. And so I think the malleability is one is somebody really, are they truthfully speaking what they actually believe? Are they capable of being convinced and persuaded to see something otherwise? If you don't believe that that is true, it's just going to come down to power and violence and a lack of persuasion, which we're seeing in spades in the world around us right now.
That's our culture.
That's our culture. And so we want to think very carefully about how we talk about things. And I mean, obviously, let's put our cards on the table here, Cameron. We're Christians. We're looking at this from a paradigm of Jesus's perspective of reconciliation and forgiveness. And
we believe in grace and
we
forgiveness.
believe in grace and forgiveness and are thankful for the mercy that God and other people extend to us in our own lives. And that is not a license for us to be flippant with the facts or to get things wrong or to be irritating or to falsely repent just because we think that the tide's turning and public opinion is swaying us to say something. Like, no, that's not what we're talking about. But I do see a clear distinction between what I have known to be true in my experience in the church, and then I can celebrate flickers and glimmers of hope when I see that in the broader culture as it comes along. So, yeah, that's basically the way that I would see that.
And even speaking as a citizen, I would say to the Douglas Murray kind of approach, if we have a culture that is filled with the politics of contempt, and if it is leading to ever more, higher levels of disintegration and, you name it, corruption, hostility, why would we want to, what rational sense would it make to call for more contempt and more hostility and rage when somebody changes their mind or admits that they were cowed?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the cynical side of me thinks Douglas Murray has a readership. Douglas Murray has an audience. And
he didn't lose anything by saying that.
Nothing. But see, some people would think, well, he's saying things that are vastly unpopular. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that he's speaking against the cultural zeitgeist. No, in the sense that he has his massive audience who are counting on him to have that same combative tone. And if were he to depart from that, there would be a price for him to pay. And I'm not saying I'm not accusing him of being a coward or anything like that. I'm saying he's got his constituency as well, and he's playing to that constituency also.
So any speaker or writer is in part a product of their audience. And that's great for the two of us to remember. And I would like to just point out, time out here, making a little timeout sign with my hands for those of you listening, and say that I think one of the great things about thinking out loud is the nuanced response that even when our listeners disagree with us, you guys send us some pretty interesting emails sometimes.
Disagree? I'm just kidding.
But it's also not like, and I think you should die at the end of it. Like, well, maybe, not so much on this. Have you thought about it? It is far more, we want the relationship to continue.
Yeah.
And we respectfully think we can disagree and people can grow as a result of it. That's healthy. I like that. And it just models something that's totally different than what I see elsewhere. But you don't want to be a preacher who feels like you're dancing to the tune of the political whims or wishes of your congregation. You don't want to get you know why I think Malcolm made this distinction? I bet it's miserable living with yourself when the vast majority of people think you think one thing and you think another thing, and you're the only one who knows that you think differently. I don't think you can put a dollar value on contentment. I'm saying, no, actually, I'm just going to say what I think I'd say and let the cards fall as they may. That's how that has to go.
We live in a time where being devoted to the truth can come with a high cost. And this is not unique. If you look down the corridors of history, you will see there are a couple of things that you can do that will pretty much guarantee you opposition from a lot of folks. One thing is you can be a peacemaker. Ironically, if you truly are a peacemaker, if you're truly a conciliatory kind of person, it's a wonderful thing to do, but you can expect some serious resistance. That's just the way it goes. And the other thing you can do is really be devoted to the truth and the pursuit of the truth. And if you want a very clear picture of what this looks like, just let's look to our Lord Jesus Christ, who perfectly embodied both of these pursuits. And we can see the way his life turned out, but we can also bank on his promises. And if we are banking on his promises, if we are following him, that means that we are marching to the beat of a very different drummer from the spirit of our age. And that's as true in 2025 as it was in 1775. So cultural dynamics change, and there are some unique challenges that show up, but that basic tension is perennial, especially and for God's people who are described as aliens and we are strangers in a strange land and making our way through this world, which is not our permanent destination. We should expect to feel that basic tension. It's there, it's real, and it's okay. And which is why we don't do it alone.
Let me conclude us with these words, Cameron. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.